The presence of large-scale, pervasive, invasive, secretive, and lethally effective internal security forces was, and is, a staple of totalitarian regimes around the world. In Cold War terms, when it came to the day-to-day surveillance of ordinary citizens and the rooting out of counter-revolutionaries in mass purges, we naturally think of organizations like the KGB and the Stasi. What we don't often think of is how this worked in the most populous communist country on Earth. How did the Chinese Communist Party keep tabs on hundreds of millions of citizens? I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at Mao's main internal security organ, the Ministry of Public Security. This is the Cold War. After years of civil war, Mao Zedong finally established control over mainland China by December of 1949. He quickly moved to dissolve the existing intelligence agency that had been employed by the Chinese Communist Party, the Social Affairs Department, or SAD. Instead, the functions of counter-espionage and secret police duties were transferred to a newly created body, the Ministry of Public Security, or Ministry of Public Safety, the MPS, led by Luo Ruiqing, a longtime Mao loyalist. This massive organization also oversaw regular police operations, therefore concentrating all internal security under one roof. Luo, initially reluctant to take the ministerial position, proved to be more than adept at his job. By the end of 1950, the MPS claimed to have cracked down on 2,070 cases of espionage, including plots to assassinate Mao and other party officials. According to a CIA report dated from the 22nd of December 1952, the MPS was structured in three main departments: a secretariat, which included the administrative offices, a foreign affairs department, and an investigation and research department. From its headquarters in Beijing, the MPS coordinated a network of public security bureaus, or PSBs, which were present in every large town and city in mainland China. Each PSB included three main operative branches: the Public Security Division, the Public Security Force, and the Investigation and Research Division. The Public Security Division coordinated platoon-sized detachments of regular People's Police, in charge of supervising sanitation, traffic, and monitoring members of the so-called special population. These were known reactionaries, foreigners, former Kuomintang members, and citizens who had lived abroad. The Public Security Force, by contrast, was a company-sized unit of agents recruited on the recommendation of party members. They were in charge of protecting party cadres and arresting political criminals. Finally, the Investigation and Research Division was a small team of 5 operatives, led by a chief and a deputy. These agents kept files and statistics on suspected enemies of the CCP, handled civilian informants, and investigated and arrested high-profile political suspects. Besides the operative sections, each PSB also oversaw a more sinister correctional division, which administered both regular prisons as well as forced labor camps. This put the MPS in charge of the infamous Laogai labor camps, the Chinese equivalent of the Gulag. Some estimates have put the number of deaths caused by the Laogai at anywhere between 15 and 25 million Chinese citizens. Further details on the operations of a typical PSB were revealed to the CIA in 1958 by a defector based in Canton. The Canton PSB employed 7,000 personnel, of which 2,000 were professionals. The remainder, presumably, were civilian informants. The professional staff were recruited following strict criteria. Would-be MPS agents had to be young, below the age of 30, with no history of family wealth, no history of relations with political parties other than the CCP, no history of travel outside China, and no relatives living abroad. Most of the agents were recruited from 4 groups: the party's youth league, high school graduates, wives of MPS employees, and, curiously, former Kuomintang police or intelligence officers. Sometimes existing skills trumped the risk of disloyalty. Fresh recruits were given basic training in public security operations at the local Institute of Public Security, followed by a 6-month trial period. They were then fully hired and their training was completed on the job, a training which included daily and thorough political indoctrination. Ambitious agents could apply for a 2-year course at the National Institute of Public Security in Beijing. Promotion to senior ranks, however, was decided by the local committee of the CCP. The party was also in charge of ensuring discipline among PSB personnel. The CCP kept tabs on the political views of the agents, imposing several degrees of sanctions in case of transgression, from crawling sessions of self-criticism up to criminal prosecution. Personnel were monitored for their private conduct, expected to be impeccable. The defector we mentioned earlier had been disciplined twice by the party, the first time for having struck his wife, the second time for having criticized the party meetings as, quote, dull and time-consuming, which may have been true, but you weren't supposed to point it out. So let's talk operations. One of the MPS's early successes was the Downey-Fecteau affair, which took place in November 1952. Between July and September of that year, the CIA had airdropped a team of 6 Chinese operatives in the Jilin region of Manchuria. This was part of the CIA's Third Force project, a guerrilla faction of anti-communists who were not aligned with the Kuomintang. They were instructed to engage in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare. The CIA's strategy was for the Third Force to distract Chinese military resources away from the war being waged in Korea. It's not known exactly how, but between September and November, the 6-man team was uncovered and arrested by the MPS. The Third Force agents were then turned by the MPS, very possibly by simply torturing them into compliance. Whatever the cause, the result was a clever ruse. In November, the Third Force members radioed 22-year-old John Downey, their CIA handler. The team requested for one of their operatives to be air exfiltrated. This was a delicate procedure which involved a low-flying plane snatching up the target strapped to a complex rig. Although the system had been developed during the Second World War for the Air Force, it had been deemed too risky to ever use, and this would be the first time. Downey replied that the exfiltration would take place on the 29th of November at 2400 hours. The operation should have been carried out by trained personnel with Civil Air Transport, CAT, that's the CIA's private airline. But due to a last-minute bureaucratic hitch, 2 of the CAT operators were replaced by Downey himself, along with his colleague, 25-year-old Richard Fecteau. On the agreed date, a CAT C-47 aircraft flew towards the agreed pickup point when the MPS sprung its trap. 2 camouflaged anti-aircraft guns opened fire, scoring hits on the Skytrain's cockpit. The pilots managed to steer the plane into a controlled crash landing, but both died in the impact. Downey and Fecteau suffered minor wounds and were immediately arrested by the waiting MPS. The 2 CIA agents were driven to a police station in Antu, where an MPS officer, clad in leather jacket and wielding a pistol, pointed at Downey and said in English, "You are Jack. Your future is very dark." Downey and Fecteau were shackled with heavy leg irons and taken to Mukden for interrogation. They were neither tortured nor beaten, but subjected to sleep deprivation and psychological abuse. Eventually, both confessed to being CIA spies, but did not reveal any information of importance. For example, when the MPS insisted they provide identities and descriptions of fellow agents, Fecteau only gave them first names and described his Boston University football teammates. After 2 years of solitary confinement, Downey and Fecteau were finally put on trial, where a military court found them guilty of espionage. Downey, as the chief culprit, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Fecteau, as assistant chief culprit, only received 20 years. On the 23rd of November 1954, the MPS publicly acknowledged that the 2 agents, thus far presumed dead by the CIA, were both alive and in custody. The agency immediately requested for the US government to put pressure on Beijing to free the 2 men, but there were several diplomatic impediments. Officially, Washington had declared that Downey and Fecteau were civilian employees with the Department of Defense. As such, their freedom could not be negotiated, as had been the case with other POWs from the Korean War. Moreover, the State Department had not officially recognized the Communist Chinese government, and their stance was to avoid any bargain, concession, or negotiation with Beijing. The 2 men endured their sentence, mostly in solitary confinement, throughout the 1950s and 1960s. In December 1971, Fecteau's sentence expired and he was released, while Downey's terms were reduced from life to a further 5 years from that date. The following year, President Nixon resumed diplomatic relations with China, which allowed him to issue an appeal for Downey's release in March 1973. Following the ordeal, both agents received the Distinguished Intelligence Medal. And as a curiosity, John Downey got married in 1975. His wife Audrey, of Chinese origin, had been born in Manchuria, not far from where he was captured. Okay, back to the MPS itself. Besides this successful action in counter-espionage, the MPS is probably best known for being the strong arm of the party when it came to large-scale purges. Between 1950 and 1952, the MPS was the driving force of the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries. The identification of such targets relied largely on the millions of voluntary tips provided by civilian informants. They were the MPS's chief weapon at the end of the day. Hundreds of thousands of citizens were arrested due to their alleged suspicious backgrounds, and up to 700,000 were executed. Due process and accuracy may not have been a guiding factor in many of these cases. By 1953, the MPS director Luo Ru-ching may have realized that they had gone too far. Fearing popular backlash, Luo and Ling Yun, the chief of Beijing's PSB, enacted reforms aimed at finding actual hostile elements rather than just the mass murder of civilians. These reforms did not completely prevent future purges, however. Purges which, by the way, did not spare the CCP leadership, the MPS itself, nor other members of the intelligence community. As early as December 22, 1951, CCP official Luo Ju-qing had announced an upcoming purge within the MPS to get rid of grafters, bureaucrats, and corrupt personnel. In January 1952, the purge was already in motion, as the director and deputy director of the MPS administrative office had been arrested on charges of taking bribes. But the event that rocked the CCP to the core was the Gao Rao Hanian affair. In the winters of 1952 and 53, Mao chaired planning meetings for the first 5-year plan. During these meetings, party leaders including Premier Zhou Enlai and Vice Chairman Liu Shaoqi disagreed with Mao's proposed timeline and implementation methods. This led to a rift within the party, with Mao attacking the rightist tendencies of Zhou and Liu. Gao Gang, chairman of the State Planning Commission, and Rao Shushi, Minister of Organization Department of the CCP, apparently sided with Mao, conspiring to isolate Liu. The great helmsman should have been pleased, but in 1954 he changed his course and attacked Gao and Rao instead, accusing them of building an anti-party alliance to seize power. This sparked another round of purges. Gao committed suicide on the 17th of August 1954, leading the MPS to focus its attention on Rao and anybody who was or had ever been connected to him, especially during his time as Shanghai's party secretary. In August of 1954, the former chief of police for Shanghai, Yang Fan, was arrested alongside former spy Hu Junhee. Some 1,000 party members in Shanghai alone were arrested and mistreated. In April of 1955, Rao himself was detained by the MPS for counter-revolutionary crimes. Only a few days later, the MPS came knocking on the door of Pan Hanian, who had been a master spy with the MPS's predecessor, the SAD, as well as deputy mayor of Shanghai since 1949. Pan was also charged with counter-revolutionary crimes. Shockingly, the MPS had dug up evidence that, during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Civil War, Pan had entertained contacts with both the Japanese secret services and the Kuomintang. But the alleged traitor had an unlikely ally, General Lei Konong, attached to the CCP's Central Military Commission. General Li conducted a lightning-fast investigation on Pan's background, producing a full report for Mao by the 29th of July. According to Li's findings, Pan had indeed been in contact with both the Japanese and the Kuomintang, but he had done so on orders from Mao and other party leaders. Pan, a masterful spy, had been the handler of several Kuomintang double agents up until 1949. And during the war with Japan, he had been feeding false information to the Japanese occupation forces in Shanghai to prevent an early peace deal between Tokyo and the nationalist faction. It would seem, however, that Mao and his Politburo ignored Li's report and proceeded to punish Pan Hanian and his wife Dong Hui, also a former secret agent. Pan and Dong were arrested and sentenced to a laogai, dying in 1977 and 1979 respectively. They were posthumously exonerated of all charges in 1982. But back in 1955, the campaign of internal terror did not conclude with Pan's arrest. It was exacerbated by the bombing on April 11th of an Air India passenger flight, a plane on which Zhou Enlai was supposed to fly. The MPS investigation found that the aircraft had been destroyed by a bomb planted by the Kuomintang in Hong Kong. This led to another wave of investigations against alleged counter-revolutionaries. 18 million people came under scrutiny, with almost 260,000 arrested or executed. During the rest of the 1950s and early 1960s, the MPS established an iron grip on Chinese society by deploying a devastating weapon, bureaucracy, and one of its more devilish incarnations in particular, the hukuo system. This is a household registration policy which requires all citizens to record their home area, forbids internal movements without permission, and records all visits outside the area of one's residence. Very similar to the Soviet propiska, in fact. The MPS will return to become a protagonist of mass security operations and naturally purges in 1966 with the onset of Mao's infamous Cultural Revolution. But we are going to look at that separately in a different video. But before that, we'll return to the world of Chinese espionage with a dedicated video on the Shu Peipu Borsicot affair, a story so incredible it should probably be made into a movie. Actually, it was David Cronenberg's 1993 film M. Butterfly. So to make sure you don't miss those or any of our future episodes, be sure to like and subscribe, but don't denounce the bell button as a subversive counter-revolutionary. It's just doing its job. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.